Thank you so much first for inviting me to be part of this wonderful day and to be in this incredible city. To the speaker, to the ministers and senators, the work I do in the United States is aimed at you, not at my colleagues in medicine, because I think the greatest work we can do are outside of the walls of a hospital. They're in schools, they're in community centers, they're in places of worship, they're in rough neighborhoods, and they're in nice neighborhoods. It was mentioned earlier that I have an affection for your great country and this great city. Both are true. And I do have a bit of a funny story. Myself and my siblings were raised in exactly the same way, with the full knowledge that my father was born in Warsaw. And so I believe that makes me Polish, but my four sisters tell everyone they're Czech. And I have no idea why that's okay, but they like the sound of it better than saying they're Polish, which I'm fine with saying I'm Polish. So let me tell you about my work and the work we're doing, not just in this country, in the United States, but around the world. I do just want to pay an homage to the fact that we're all bits and pieces of everyone we've known and everyone we've worked with across the course of our careers. So these are individuals at the University of Vermont who I'm blessed to work with, drawing some attention to Masha Ivanova, who grew up in Moscow and who has helped me with some of our public health distributions. Tom Achenbach, who created a taxonomy aimed at measuring the degree to which we're sad, anxious, naughty, quirky, or inattentive, rather than to engage in a flawed perception that some of us are depressed and some of us aren't. And it's the reason I left Washington University in St. Louis to go to Vermont, was to work with a pragmatic individual who recognized that all of us have vulnerabilities, and it's going to be central to my talk and the work that I do. But let me break down just some core aims of what I hope to achieve today with all of you. And then I'm going to present my science and the science of colleagues in my field to try to provide you with the evidence that these aims that I'm presenting up front not only are realistic, but they've already been fulfilled. And it's going to be our job, and our job meaning those of us in science, those of us in medicine, but even more so those of us in policy, public policy, those of us who make decisions, to change the way that we approach the health and well-being of children. So my first claim, and let me know if you disagree with any of my claims, my first claim is that all humans have brains. And that's important. I trained with the Human Genome Project. Most of my first 100 papers were devoted to genetic vulnerabilities for human emotional behavioral problems. And I think it's important that all of you know that over 50% of the human genome is devoted to genes that impact on the structure and function of the human brain. The brain runs the entire body. The brain runs the heart, the lungs, the kidneys, and in a bit you'll see why that's so important. So the first thing I want to make a claim is we all have brains, and that my talk is going to be focused on that very important point. Second, that our brains are the home of our emotions, our beliefs, and our behaviors. Again, I hope that you can all accept that. And if you accept that, this is a stepping off point for a reason for you starting to understand that we need to change the way we approach our society. Because if all health comes from emotional behavioral health, if I can win that argument, then all of the sudden you're going to have to focus on health promoting and illness prevention strategies aimed at improving emotional behavioral health first. So here's my claim. Whether we drink or not, smoke cigarettes or not, use drugs or not, beat our kids or ourselves or not, our emotional behavioral decisions based on our emotions, beliefs, and behaviors. All of those things precede the vast majority of medical problems, legal problems, substance use and abuse problems that currently exist in developed countries. In the same way, whether we exercise or not, meditate or not, do yoga or not, sleep well or not, eat well or not, play and produce music or not, are emotional behavioral decisions. And if you start to understand all of those behaviors are tied into whether or not we're obese, have diabetes, cardiovascular illness, metabolic syndrome, and emotional behavioral problems, you can start to see where our science starts to take hold in public policy. The next thing is we have to get over, as your speaker said so beautifully, we have to get over the fact that emotional behavioral problems are closeted, are things that are silent, are things that people don't talk about. So I'd like to ask you to participate with me for a second. Please raise your hand if you've ever worried. We feel that. Please raise your hand if you've ever been a bit sad. A bit inattentive. A bit naughty. These are essential human behaviors that come from the human brain. All of us are a bit sad and bad and naughty and inattentive and quirky. And it's the degree to which we express those things that put us in a diagnostic area or not. And those diagnoses are what are stigmatizing, not the common human experience that I've been so anxious that at one point in my life I might have had an anxiety disorder. I've been so inattentive that at one point in my life I might have had an ADHD-like problem. But people spend so much time in denial of this common human experience of emotional behavioral strengths and weaknesses. So one of the things that I've done in my work and in my community and my work with young people, high school-age children, college-age children, moms and dads, is for us to first become comfortable with our own emotional behavioral health and vulnerabilities so that those around us can talk openly and evenly about their emotional behavioral problems. That's my claim. The next claim, and there's very little doubt that this is true, that these emotional behavioral problems precede and lead to general medical problems and most of society's struggles. So for those of us who've spent our careers in child psychiatry, and psychology, with illnesses that are generally stigmatized and sometimes not respected by policymakers, this turn, which I'll spend a good deal of time on, where we can now prove that childhood adversity, that childhood stress, affects the genome of that child, affects the structure and function of that child's brain, and directly leads to her having obesity, hypertension, diabetes, cardiovascular illness in adults, now allows policymakers to say, I need to stop those problems in childhood so we don't have to carry the burden of diabetes, cancer, obesity, substance use and abuse, and the criminal who broke into your lovely vacation moment, almost doubtless to gain resources to buy drugs to feed another emotional behavioral problem. Some of us struggle more than others. And the explanation for why some struggle and others do not is now better understood as an interaction between one's genome and one's environment. Think of it this way. All of us have emotions. All of us live in an environmental space. It is but for the grace of God, the genetics we have and the environment that we live in, that we're either protected from or put at risk for extreme manifestations of anxiety, sadness, inattention, aggression, and quirkiness. Claim emotional, behavioral, and the majority of general medical problems occur as a result of stress experienced across life, but particularly during childhood. It all comes down to how the human organism responds to being stressed. And I'm going to show you the biology of that. And I'm going to try to argue with you that a stressed mom and a stressed dad in an economically disadvantaged situation who are struggling with alcohol and drugs create an environment, not purposely, they don't want to damage their children, but they create a stressful environment that directly impacts on that child's brain structure, function, and the arc of his or her potential. Now, the other thing you all have to embrace and understand in medicine, and particularly in the hallowed grounds of this great medical center, doesn't like to admit, is that once you are an adult, and once you struggle with obesity, diabetes, hypertension, cardiovascular illnesses, or major adult psychiatric illnesses, or substance abuse problems, medicine and society is almost completely ineffective in treating those conditions. The mega business of modern medicine is based on a canard that we can treat diabetes, obesity, hypertension. If you look at the data, the best we do is reduce the severity of those things. We don't cure them. And those people die young, and they die at great expense. This is a claim that when we go to Q&A, I'll present you with more evidence of. But in the end, you're faced with this really interesting dilemma. Should we promote health and prevent these things from ever happening, or continue to invest extraordinary sums in trying to treat them in the adult condition when they're nearly untreatable? Preventing these adverse experiences in childhood could lead to decreased adult psychiatric and general medical problems, thereby reversing the incredible economic negative tide of modern healthcare in developed societies. Thus, to achieve better general medical health for a society, we first have to promote better emotional behavioral health, and the way to do that is focusing on children, families, and our communities. And in fact, in my work with human economists, it is far less expensive to build healthy children, families, and communities than to pay for prescriptive interventions that are largely ineffective. So I'm going to argue now it's time to move fully into a mode of health promotion and illness prevention for all children and all families, because all children and all families have brains. And the brain experiences an environment that leads to his or her thoughts, beliefs, and behaviors. If we do this work in schools, thank you to the Minister of Education for being here, because you lead the fight. If we do this work in community centers, in sport, and in modern medicine, we have a chance to shift the focus of healthcare from an ineffective intervention-based industry to an effective health promotion paradigm that will benefit and reduce the economic burden of general medical, psychiatric, substance use and abuse, and criminal behavior. So all my work is devoted to one really easy idea. It's time to build healthy brains. Modern neuroscience, modern genomics allows us to have this really wonderful invitation. We can shift developed countries' attitudes away from developing the body from the neck down, which our countries have done forever. You heard your speaker talk about you should look in a certain way, dress in a certain way, have a certain body type, to being focused on having a certain commitment to building a healthy brain. So that's what I'm going to try to convince you of, is that we can commit ourselves to building healthy brains. So I'm going to argue that child psychiatry, psychology, pediatrics, family medicine, educational settings should play a key role in healthcare reform in developed countries. That all of us should make a principled argument that all health comes from emotional behavioral health. Again, to review, why we drink or not, smoke or not, abuse ourselves or not, that comes from the brain. And that although our science is not yet perfected, this new field of epigenetics lets us understand the impact of a negative environment on the genome, the brain, and subsequent health. And I'll show you the model we've developed and is being exported around the world. So let's seek out a role of understanding brain science and helping children and families achieve optimal health. Let's not just train our bodies, let's train our brain. And in fact, at our programmatic college-age work, our argument is train your brain, your body will follow. Train your body only and your brain will struggle. It's a lot of work we're going to go through today. I want to make sure you all understand with relief that at 9:30 there'll be a bit of a break so that you don't have to endure me for 3 hours without a break. Back to the core aim. All of us at one time or another have experienced emotional behavioral problems. You've seen this over and over again in developed countries. At any given time, 23% of children meet one of those diagnoses for a psychiatric illness. Remember, my argument is that all of us have a variance to the degree to which we express it. But then my new employee and colleague, William Copeland, who runs the Great Smoky Mountain Study, did an incredible research project. He said instead of just saying at 1997, what percentage of kids had an emotional behavioral problem? It was 27%. What Bill did is he looked at a large population of kids from 0 all the way up to 18. And he showed that almost 80% of us met criteria for a psychiatric disorder at one time or another over the course of our development. Making the experience of a psychiatric vulnerability the rule rather than the exception. So for those of you in this room who have had a hidden or at least shadowed experience with psychopathology, what you should now experience is the fact that you are part of general humanity and that all of us struggle. And in fact, the individual who says he or she doesn't have or never has had an emotional behavioral problem might be dealing with some denial or just be very blessed. To start off this new commitment, I stand in front of you a very anxious man who is highly inattentive. It's worked okay for me. Now, if you look at the end point of this graph, you'll see this sort of very sad thing that now children and adolescents suicide is now exceeded the rate of homicide and other accidental deaths. We've created modern cultures, particularly in this era of this judgment-heavy social media era that our kids love to live in. And every one of those Instagrams or Snapchat stories are about judgment of others, judgment of yourself. And you certainly have got to be cool, smart, look well. Or you can learn on these same platforms how to kill yourself. It's important that we all understand that our children have ancient minds and they're living in a very modern world. And if we don't start to do something for them, these trends are going to get worse and worse. And this translates into psychiatric illness in adults, with 27% of us walking around with one of those DSM diagnoses, and that ignores substance use and abuse, which itself is around another 30%. Again, showing you that if you really did a deep dive on the toll of emotional behavioral problems across society, and in fact your society, you'd see that more adults struggle with than don't struggle with these problems. Are people generally comfortable with this idea? Because if not, it's time to get comfortable with it. And then here's an interesting thing. This is our country, which is dealing with its own special kind of stress right now. We wake up in the morning and wonder about our own leadership from Washington, D.C. on down. And we have more child psychiatrists than any country in the world, and those red states are considered states where there is an absolute severe shortage of child psychiatrists, meaning there's not enough docs to treat these illnesses once they occur. So Andres and Joaquin and I were involved in national and international efforts to produce more child psychiatrists. But everybody in this room needs to know, if we don't switch the way we do things, there'll never be enough child psychiatrists to take care of these increasing problems. So why not prevent them before they occur? Why is prevalence growing so quickly? Well, Shonkoff and others, myself, Charlie Zena, have put together this toxic stress relationship that as the stress on families, on the stress on children becomes greater, has a dramatic effect on your genome, dramatic effect on your brain, dramatic effect on your ability to learn, dramatic effect on your ability to achieve, dramatic effect on your ability to get a job, and then to move forward in life. In our own country, Americans like to think we're healthier than people who live in other countries. This idea of global and national denial is real. It's a myth. In 1980, the U.S. was 15th among affluent countries in life expectancy. 2009, we slipped to the 27th. We have the most expensive healthcare system in the world and one of the most least effective. And our solution is to pour more money and more money and more money into one of the most ineffective healthcare systems in the world. Beautiful summary: to become healthier and reduce the growth of public and private spending on medical care, and let me add here, criminal incarceration and substance use and abuse. We must create a seismic shift in how we approach health and the actions we take. As a country, we need to expand our focus to address on how to stay healthy in the first place. Robert Wood Johnson, a big think tank in our country, agrees, because we looked and did a deep dive and showed that 1 in 3 children in our country is overweight or obese. 3 in 4 Americans aged 17 to 24 couldn't even enlist in our military if they wanted to because of pre-existing health care and psychiatric and drug and alcohol problems. That's a stain. Robert Wood Johnson said it's time to help people struggle to provide healthy, nurturing environments, particularly parents. Robert Wood Johnson says we must take a health-focused approach to healthcare financing and delivery, public policy. And Nobel Prize winners agree, Jim Heckman in his laureate work of 2011. The logic is quite clear from an economic standpoint. We can invest early to close disparities and prevent achievement gaps, or we can pay to remediate disparities when they are harder and more expensive to close. Either way, we're going to pay. We're going to have to do both for a while. Those people who are struggling with substance use and abuse, criminal behavior, psychiatric illness, we have to do something for them, and I'll show you what our plan is. But in the meantime, we should stop the next generation of young children from becoming drug-addled, depressed, obese. We're really kind of changed to this idea that investing early allows us to shape the future, where investing later changes us to fixing the missed opportunities of the past. We start to look at the economics of this. Intervening early, it was mentioned today about aggression. Just intervening early can lead to $1 trillion per year savings in the United States by getting in the way of a child developing things called oppositional defiant disorder, aggressive conduct disorder, antisocial personality disorder, and substance abuse. So the next claim I made was that adversity can affect the structure and function of the human brain, and that adversity is common. ACEs, which Joaquin told me don't have any acronyms, and I see 2 here, and I apologize, Professor, is adverse child experiences. So my claim was emotional, behavioral, and the majority of general medical problems occur in the face of stress or adversity. The ACEs project, the Adverse Child Experience Study, I encourage you all to look up, is the largest study of public health that almost no one has ever heard of. And what it is a study of a child, an adult when he or she was a child, or a child or adolescent right now, having endured abuse or neglect, household dysfunction. And if you look at these 10 items, these are considered the 10 adversity items. And if you go through this and look at this, you can score yourself. Were you a victim of physical abuse? Were you a victim of sexual abuse? Did you have a family member who had a psychiatric illness or attempted suicide? Were you denied food? Etc. And if you score yourself, just do a quick score on what your childhood was like. And if you have 2 or more of those, just remember your ACEs score would be 2. And you can start to see what adversity and the role of adversity in your own life. And just remember that children living in poverty have an average ACEs score of 6. So if you want, you can go to www.childhealthdata.org and look at this data. But if you look at the prevalence of children in the United States who've had 2 or more ACEs, you can see that it exceeds 23% and almost maps on the number of kids who meet a DSM diagnosis. I moved to Vermont with my wife 25 years ago, believing that we were going to raise our children in this bucolic state. And if you look at the second Venn diagram, percentage of children in Vermont who've had ACEs, it's actually higher than the national average. Vermont has a lot of poverty. People around the world think of us for our maple syrup and our beautiful trees, but we're also a state marked by rural poverty and adverse experiences. Now, knowing this, it's important for you to understand that if you've had 2 or more ACEs, the likelihood of you having one of those chronic medical problems exceeds 30%. That's just with 2. Sorry. A more stunning discovery is that if you lived in poverty, you were at a much higher rate to have 2 or more ACEs. But if you lived in absolute luxury, 20% of the time you still had 2 or more adverse experiences in your life. So for those of you who think we should focus just on kids in poverty or just on kids who have psychiatric illness, it's important to know you'll miss up to 30% of kids who are experiencing adversity and are at risk becoming drug addicts, depressed, anxious, unemployed, etc. Think about it this way. Money can buy you a great many things. Better food, better clothes, a better car, often better schools. But it doesn't protect you from seeing your father hit your mother, or alcohol or drug abuse in your house, or having a sibling who's spiraling out of control. Health promotion and illness prevention should be for everyone. Here's the big thing. If you see a kid with 2 or more ACEs, only 60% of the time only 35% of the time will the mother be in good medical health. So you can identify a child who's raised in adversity and understand that mom and dad have severe general medical problems. These are the same moms and dads who don't get health care. But if you had a model where you said, I'm going to promote health in children and find out that mom or dad are struggling, you have a point of contact. So here's the famous studies. Folletti did the first massive ACEs study, the impact of adversity on development, and showed that certainly if children had 2 or more ACEs, they were at increased risk for psychiatric disorders, substance use and abuse, and criminal behavior, but they were at a much higher risk for ischemic heart disease, stroke, respiratory problems, diabetes, and cancer. And again, remember policymakers who are anti-psychiatric, they are almost always pro, let's reduce obesity, diabetes, and cardiovascular illness. In Vermont, we've learned if you've had 4 or more ACEs, you're at increased risk for adult alcoholism, IV drug abuse, being on antidepressants, having a sexually transmitted disease, having obesity, having a learning disorder, and engaging in criminal behavior. The summary is pretty clear, startling, and an invitation for us to assert a seismic shift in how we do things. ACEs affect children around the world. They come from all socioeconomic strata. They have parents who are less well, both moms and dads, and more stressed out. These kids struggle at home and school and in the community. They're associated with the vast majority of negative health outcomes that account for the vast majority of healthcare costs in developed countries, and they are by definition preventable. And this is where prevention and health promotion strategies come into play. Okay. As a scientist, I'm required to tell you how adversity leads to these negative impacts on the brain. Fair? Some of us struggle more than others. Why? So by now, most of you know that abuse, family strife, emotional neglect, and harsh discipline are associated with negative adult outcomes of depression, drug abuse, and anxiety, substance use disorder, criminal behavior. Many didn't know that those same factors put you at risk for cardiovascular illness. You have a right to ask those of us in science, how does it do it? Because all of you have known somebody who came from a horrific environment, raised themselves up and achieved remarkable things. So why can some people have adversity and not struggle? And why could others in adversity struggle? You have a right to say to scientists, explain that to me. And the explanation is to start to say, to do research on how things like daily hassles, stressful life events, having a mom or dad who suffer from emotional behavioral disorders or substance abuse, having moms or dads who struggle with the lack of knowledge, skills, and attitudes to raise a healthy child, or a mom or dad who's raising children alone. All of that affects the ability of that parent to parent, which directly impacts on child development at a genetic and structural and functional neuroimaging level. Our field is called epigenetics. Can I have you raise your hand if you've heard of this term, epigenetics? Great, so many. And the rest, it's quite easy. By now, most of you know that all of us were given a code of A, C, G's, and T's. A always goes with T, G always goes with C, and they are connected by a phosphate backbone. And they wind together, so these 3 billion base pairs create this gorgeous alpha helix. That's your genome. That's height, weight, IQ, temperament, personality, etc. Epigenetics means post or after genetic modification. So you might have the most beautiful ACGTs in the world, but you can modify your genome by either turning on or turning off important genes. There's a term in organic chemistry, which most people love, called a methyl group, which is simply a carbon with 3 hydrogens on it. If you take a carbon with 3 hydrogens, a methyl group, and put it on the phosphate backbone, the P between a C and a G, you can silence that gene. An easy way to think about DNA methylation is it's like throwing a tree trunk on a train track. Your train track still looks the same, but your trains can't run. Your genes cannot produce the proteins that you need to live a healthy life. I can see people going, oh my God, it's hot in here, and he's starting to talk about too much science. So let me make it a little easier for you. These are identical twins. They were separated at birth. Their DNA is 100% the same. They have the same A, C, G, and T. They were reunited late in the 3rd decade of life. They both married a woman with the same first name. They both became firemen. They both had the same breed of dogs. Their DNA tells you why they look so much alike, even down to their pinky finger dangling off the bottom of the beer can. But their epigenetics tells you why they're so different. Which of these 2 men do you think was raised in adversity? Food insecurity. I'm hungry, no food. I'm hungry, no food. I'm hungry, no food. The human organism is very, very conservative. Let's methylate. Let's throw a tree trunk on the train track for those satiety genes because they're not working. Now you get grown up and you can get all the food you need. You don't have a regulatory system to say, I'm full now. People understand that? I'll give you better examples. Let's talk about stress. You've heard me earlier say all of healthcare is the organism's reaction to stress. Michael Meany, Singapore, Montreal, did this incredible work that looked at the stress axis. You've all felt this experience. You've been frightened. You get a serotonin surge, your face gets red, your pulse rate goes up, you're really worried. And then when the fear resolves, you actually calm yourself, and then you're deeply fatigued. What that is stress occurred, adrenal corticoids went to your hippocampus, this little seahorse in your brain, and said, we're under a stress. Your emotional memory said, let's go to the hypothalamus and give us some steroids. And steroids make you very tired. But you can't do that 24 hours a day, 7 days a week without us shutting down that system. Some of us live under chronic stress. So Michael found two kinds of mice occurring in nature. One called a low licking grooming, low LG mouse. The other called a high licking grooming, high LG mouse. Now, high licking grooming mice moms arch their backs so that their pups can get to their breast and feed. And then they lick and groom and lick and groom and lick and groom their pups. Low licking grooming moms lay flat. They spend just the same amount of time with their pups as the high licking grooming moms, but they don't lick and groom and they don't try to get the pup food. Do you get this? One mom taking care of her pups, the other kind of neglectful. When you put these pups in a scientific paradigm, the offspring of the high licking grooming moms could deal with stress and were not frightened by a strange environment. The pups who were not licked and groomed when put in stressful situations were wildly unsuccessful. Here is a high licking grooming mom taking care of her pup. What you see is she licks and grooms and licks and grooms and licks and grooms and licks and grooms. Now, I'm going to show you a pup from a high licking grooming mom put on a strange platform that the pup has never seen before. And then I'm going to show you a pup of a low licking grooming mom put on the same platform. The pup is put down, does a 4-quadrant check. What's going on here? This is kind of new. Then he goes off to college. Low licking grooming mom. Pup's put on the platform. You can see a chaotic quadrant check. And the pup will start looking to the human handler saying, help me, help me, help me. Now I can show you using rat brain and mouse brain science that the low licking grooming mom's pups in the hippocampus, that region that controls stress reactivity, that region that says you can handle it, you can see with your own eyes the low licking grooming pup has a much smaller hippocampus than the high licking grooming pup. And it's all explained by this one stress reactivity receptor. Michael then did this incredible experiment where he cross-fostered the pups. So at birth, he took pups of a low-licking grooming mom and immediately gave that pup to a high-licking grooming mom. And then took pups from a high-licking grooming mom and gave it to a low-licking grooming mom. Completely reversed the stress reactivity, completely reversed the human behavior, the mouse behavior, and completely reversed the neuropathology and genetics. So in this model, illness had nothing to do with genetics and had everything to do with environment. Had everything to do with promoting the health of a pup. This is Michael Meany with the Dalai Lama, and Michael looked at that same gene in individuals who killed themselves. And what you're seeing across this long graph is the number of tree trunks placed on that genomic train track of that stress receptor gene in human beings who were abused and killed themselves. I'm stressed, no relief. I'm stressed, no relief. I'm stressed, no relief. In my own work, I looked at 1,500 adolescents who were sexually abused in adolescence and showed the primary genomic change was turning off that gene that says I can handle stress. Joan Kaufman, my colleague from Kennedy Krieger, and I looked at 100 kids who were abused and 100 kids who were not abused and did a whole genome study of trees on the train track and showed that 3 genes that were shut down were genes that were responsible for building your brain. In fact, so shut down was one of the genes, TPPP, that the more methylation, the more shut down it was, the smaller the brain of the child. This is my summer camp work. I take 500 abused children, but I ran a summer camp where we do all the fun things you should do at a summer camp. I'm the chef at the camp. I make 2,500 meals, but I also get DNA, RNA, neuropsychometric tests, EEGs, structural and functional magnetic resonance imaging. But we do all the research at a camp so abused children don't have to go to a hospital. What we found there is the more abused the child was, the more obese he or she was. And in fact, when you go to this camp and you stand on the veranda and you look at these 9 and 10-year-old little girls, and they're all obese, and you start to say, I don't need genetics or neuroimaging to understand what's going on here. Not only was it body mass index, but it was a wide variety of emotional, behavioral, and general medical problems were methylated. And then we looked at the brains, and we showed that the more a little girl was abused, the smaller her brain volume was. And in fact, the regions where she was most abused were in the right frontal middle gyrus and insula. These are the regions of the brain as I hate myself, I'm stupid, I'm ugly, I want to kill myself. Her hippocampus was smaller. Emotional memory, academic performance, processing speed. Little boys who were abused, the smaller, their inferior frontal cortex. And I'll show you later what that is. And I started to say, why would boys have one region of the brain smaller and girls another region of the brain smaller? And we found something very stunning. The girls were victims of sexual abuse. The boys were victims of physical abuse. This region of interest that the boys were damaged in, this is where the house of aggression lives, fighting and violence. The area where little girls were abused, I mentioned earlier. This is a study I do with Frank Verholtz, Henning Temeyer, Vincent Jadot in Rotterdam called Generation Rotterdam. We have 10,000 babies we've been following since 10 weeks in utero. And we have epigenetics, neuroimaging, heart imaging, gut imaging on these kids across development to tell you and us, common theme, that aggression is bad, that violence is bad, that adversity is bad, not only for your brain, but your heart, lung, and guts. So we're going to break there, because that's all the dark stuff. And when you come back, I'm going to show you the neuroscience and genomics of all the good stuff. Because it turns out, everything we've just talked about, we can reverse. So I'd like to ask if there's any questions, and then in a few minutes we'll take our first break. So I'll frame this very specifically. I made some claims. I would like to ask you about this very kind of serious and dark part of this presentation. What have I said that you would have trouble accepting? Well, I've been teaching in medical schools now for 25 years. I've never had one of my classes accept everything I said. So I'm going to take that as a good thing, and let's take a break right now and come back for the good news.